Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you're waist-deep in black water. It's pitch dark. You can't see your own hands, but you can hear things moving in the water around you. Big things, ancient things. And then, someone next to you just disappears. No goodbye, just a splash, a scream cut short, and you realize your gun is useless, your training is meaningless, and you are not the apex predator anymore. What I'm about to tell you isn't fiction. This happened. January 26, 1945. 1,000 soldiers entered a swamp. 20 came out. The rest? They became part of the most horrifying night in military history. A night so terrifying that the British soldiers who heard it happen still had nightmares decades later. This is the story of Ramree Island, and I promise you, you've never heard anything like this. Before we begin, let me ask you something. What's the worst way to die in war? A bullet? Quick, relatively painless. A bomb? You might not even know it's coming. But what if I told you there's something worse? What if you had hours, an entire night, to know exactly how you're going to die, to hear it happening to your friends, to watch it creep closer, inch by inch? That's what happened on Ramree Island, and here's what makes it even more disturbing. This wasn't an accident. The British commanders knew what would happen. They watched through binoculars as 1,000 Japanese soldiers marched into that swamp. And they said, and I quote, "Let them go. The swamp will do our work for us." They knew about the crocodiles. They knew. Let me set the scene for you. It's January 1945. World War II is reaching its brutal conclusion in the Pacific. The Japanese Imperial Army is retreating, but they're not surrendering. These are elite troops who've been trained that capture is worse than death.
Ramree Island, off the coast of Burma. It's a strategic location. Whoever controls it controls the shipping lanes. The British Royal Navy has surrounded the island. They've got battleships, heavy artillery, air support. The Japanese have nowhere to go. Now, here's where Colonel Konichi Nagasawa makes his fatal decision. The British offer him honorable surrender. His response? "We will fight to the last breath." But he can't fight on the beaches anymore. British battleships are turning the shoreline into a killing zone. So he looks at his map and he sees it, the interior swamp. 10 miles of mangrove forest, dense, hard to navigate, perfect for guerrilla warfare. Or so he thinks. What Colonel Nagasawa doesn't know, or maybe he knows but doesn't believe, is that Ramree Island is home to the largest concentration of saltwater crocodiles in the world. And these aren't just any crocodiles. These are 20-foot prehistoric monsters that haven't evolved in millions of years because they're already perfect killing machines. And they haven't eaten in a long time. Now, before we go further, you need to understand something about saltwater crocodiles. Most people think of crocodiles as lazy animals that wait by the water. That's Nile crocodiles. Saltwater crocodiles? They're different. They hunt. They're intelligent. They work together. And most terrifyingly, they specifically hunt large mammals, including humans. The British knew this. Local fishermen knew this. Hell, the Burmese people had stories about this swamp going back centuries. Stories about entire villages disappearing, about demons in the water with yellow eyes. But the Japanese, they'd been fighting in China, in the Pacific Islands. They'd never encountered anything like this. To them, a swamp was just difficult terrain, an obstacle, not a death sentence. They were about to learn the difference.
Picture this. It's noon. The sun is directly overhead, beating down on 1,000 men. They're exhausted from weeks of fighting, low on supplies, but their imperial army, they've survived worse.
The column enters the swamp. Immediately, everything changes. The war, bullets, bombs, strategy, all of that becomes irrelevant because now they're fighting something more primal, the environment itself. Let me describe this mud to you because this detail matters. This isn't normal mud. This is tidal swamp mud, a thick black sludge that's been fermenting for thousands of years. It smells like rotten eggs and death. It's waist deep in some places, chest deep in others. Every single step is a battle. Soldiers have to physically pull their legs out with their hands. Boots get sucked off and lost forever. Some men sink up to their armpits and have to be pulled out by their comrades, which means stopping, which means losing time, which means staying in the swamp longer. But it's not just the mud. The mosquitoes are so thick they look like gray clouds. Soldiers are breathing them in. Leeches drop from the trees. These aren't small leeches. These are jungle leeches the size of your finger, attaching themselves to necks, eyelids, inside mouths. By sunset, they've been marching for 6 hours. They started at mile 0. They're at mile 2. 8 miles to go. Colonel Nagasawa calls a halt. He orders his men to rest on the mangrove roots, these twisted above-water roots that the trees grow. And then he gives a strange order. Do not touch the water.
The soldiers are confused. They're thirsty. The water is brackish, salty, and undrinkable, sure, but it's cool. Their feet are covered in sores and blisters. Why not cool them off? What's the harm? Private Tanaka doesn't see the harm. He's 19 years old. He's from a farming village outside Osaka. He's been in the army for 8 months. He sits on a low branch and dangles his feet in the murky water. He closes his eyes. He thinks about home. He thinks about his mother's cooking, about the rice fields, about how when this war is over he's going to... He doesn't see the ripple. The water around his legs doesn't splash. It just bulges, like something massive is rising from underneath. A shape darker than the mud moves through the water, silent, purposeful, prehistoric. And then, Tanaka is gone. Not screaming, not fighting, just gone. There's a wet thwack sound, like a massive towel hitting concrete. The soldier sitting next to him turns around. Tanaka? All he sees are ripples. Then, 10 yards away, the water erupts. Tanaka surfaces. He's screaming now, a sound that's barely human, just pure animal terror. He's being thrashed side to side like a rag doll. And now everyone can see what has him. A saltwater crocodile, 20 feet long, a living dinosaur covered in prehistoric scales and slime. It has Tanaka by the waist, and it's doing something that makes the veterans in the group go pale. The death roll. Let me explain what a death roll is, because this detail is crucial to understanding what's about to happen to these 1,000 men. A crocodile's jaw can clamp down with 3,000 pounds of force. That's enough to crush bone like a twig. But their jaw muscles for opening their mouth? Weak. A child could hold a crocodile's mouth shut with their bare hands. So how do they tear meat? They spin. They grab their prey and rotate their entire body like a drill. The spinning motion creates torque. It literally tears flesh and bone apart. And once they start, they don't stop until their prey is in pieces. Tanaka's scream cuts short as he's dragged under. The water churns. Bubbles of red blood rise to the surface, spreading out in a dark cloud. The regiment freezes. An officer yells, "Shoot it!" A dozen rifles fire into the water. Bang, bang, bang! Bullets hit the water harmlessly. The beast is already gone. Then someone yells, "They're climbing!" A massive crocodile has launched itself onto a low mud bank. It's grabbed a young officer by the leg. The officer fires his pistol wildly. Bang, bang, bang! The muzzle flash is illuminating the yellow belly of the beast, its massive clawed feet, its eyes that reflect the gunfire like mirrors. The bullets do nothing. The crocodile drags him into the slime. His screaming stops with a horrible finality. Panic breaks out. The discipline of the Imperial Japanese Army, which had withstood American flamethrowers at Iwo Jima, which had held the line against Soviet tanks at Khalkhin Gol, that discipline crumbles in minutes. Soldiers start firing blindly into the dark. Bullets ricochet off water, off trees, off rocks. Some hit their own men. Someone throws a grenade. The explosion lights up the swamp for 1 second, just 1 second, but what that flash reveals, the water is churning with reptiles, 15-footers, 20-footers, some even bigger. They're fighting each other for bodies, thrashing, spinning, their tails creating waves that rock the soldiers on their perches, and they're moving closer, tightening the circle. 2 miles offshore, on the deck of a British Royal Navy patrol boat, a young signalman named James Crawford stands watch. The sea is calm. It's a beautiful night, actually. Clear stars, gentle waves. But from the island, there's a sound. At first, he thinks it's a counterattack, some kind of riot, but then he realizes what he's hearing. Thousands of men screaming at once, not battle cries, screams of pure, primal terror. Mixed with the screams, sporadic gunfire, panicked bursts, and underneath it all, a sound he'll never forget, a low, wet, thrashing sound, like a giant mixing bowl stirring meat. Bruce Wright, a British naturalist attached to the Navy, was there that night. Years later, he wrote in his journal, "That night was the most horrible that any member of the ML crews ever experienced. The scattered rifle shots in the pitch-black swamp, punctured by the screams of wounded men crushed in the jaws of huge reptiles. The sound carried across the water with terrifying clarity. The British sailors stand on deck, gripping the rails. Their faces are pale. They hate the Japanese. They've been fighting them for years, lost friends to them, seen the atrocities. But listening to them being eaten alive, that's different. As one sailor later said, no soldier deserves that. No human being deserves that." Back in the swamp, the Japanese soldiers are learning a terrifying physics lesson. Bullets don't stop dinosaurs. Picture this. It's noon. The sun is directly overhead, beating down on 1,000 men. They're exhausted from weeks of fighting, low on supplies, but their Imperial Army, they've survived worse. The column enters the swamp. Immediately, everything changes. The war, bullets, bombs, strategy, all of that becomes irrelevant, because now they're fighting something more primal, the environment itself. Let me describe this mud to you, because this detail matters. This isn't normal mud. This is tidal swamp mud, a thick black sludge that's been fermenting for thousands of years. It smells like rotten eggs and death. It's waist deep in some places, chest deep in others. Every single step is a battle. Soldiers have to physically pull their legs out with their hands. Boots get sucked off and lost forever. Some men sink up to their armpits and have to be pulled out by their comrades, which means stopping, which means losing time, which means staying in the swamp longer. But it's not just the mud. The mosquitoes are so thick they look like gray clouds. Soldiers are breathing them in. Leeches drop from the trees. These aren't small leeches. These are jungle leeches the size of your finger, attaching themselves to necks, eyelids, inside mouths. By sunset, they've been marching for 6 hours. They started at mile 0. They're at mile 2. 8 miles to go. Colonel Nagasawa calls a halt. He orders his men to rest on the mangrove roots, these twisted above-water roots that the trees grow, and then he gives a strange order. Do not touch the water. The physical toll is terrible, but the psychological toll is worse. Captain Ito, a proud officer of the Imperial Army, looks at his decimated platoon. He started with 40 men. Now there are 12 left, clinging to his tree cluster. Below him, a crocodile is chewing on a helmet. The crunching sound, metal being crushed. It's hypnotic, horrible. Ito can't look away. He can't take it anymore.
The sound, the screams, his men begging for their mothers, for anyone to make it stop. He looks at his Nambu pistol, one bullet left. He looks at the crocodiles. He looks at the gun.
He makes the samurai's choice. Long live the emperor, he whispers. He doesn't shoot the crocodiles. He puts the barrel in his own mouth. Bang. His body falls into the water. The crocodiles swarm it instantly. For the survivors watching from the trees, this breaks something. They realize that death by bullet is a luxury, a gift, and many of them begin reaching for their own grenades, their own pistols. As dawn approaches, the frenzy reaches its peak. The smell of blood in the water has attracted scavengers from miles around. Sharks move into the river mouths. Vultures circle overhead, waiting. The swamp has become a churning machine of biological destruction. The Japanese 54th Division, an elite fighting force that conquered cities, that fought across China, is being erased from history. Not by strategy, not by superior firepower, by the food chain. A soldier named Yukio manages to find a small island of solid mud. He collapses on it, weeping. He looks around. He's the only living thing in sight. Just piles of boots, torn uniforms, and red water. So much red water. He tries to clean his rifle, but his hands are shaking so badly he drops the bolt into the mud. And then he starts laughing, a hysterical, broken laugh. He survived the night, but the sun hasn't come up yet. 0630 hours. The sun rises over Ramree Island. The mist evaporates, and the British commanders on their ships lower their binoculars in disbelief. The water in the swamp isn't brown anymore. It's red, a thick crimson sludge moving slowly with the tide. The noise has stopped. The screaming is gone. The gunfire is gone. The silence is somehow heavier than the noise had been. But the most terrifying sight is on the banks. Hundreds of saltwater crocodiles lie on the mudflats, motionless, bloated, lying in the sun, digesting the imperial army. They look like statues carved from prehistoric stone, surrounded by the debris of war, helmets, rifles, torn backpacks.
The British send patrol boats into the swamp. They have machine guns manned and ready. They expect a fight, maybe a few desperate soldiers making a last stand. But there's no one to fight. They find the first survivor clinging to a tree branch. It's Private Yukio. He's covered in mud and dried blood, no weapon. He's staring at the water with eyes that don't blink. When the British sailors approach, he doesn't surrender, doesn't raise his hands. He just shivers. A British sailor reaches out to pull him into the boat. Yukio flinches, screaming. He thinks the sailor's hand is a jaw. They pull him aboard. He curls into a fetal position on the deck. They find another man buried up to his neck in mud, literally buried himself alive to hide from the monsters, and another, and another. In total, they pulled 20 men out of that swamp, 20 out of 1,000. The survivors are taken to a field hospital. The doctors note that these men aren't just physically injured, they're shattered. When a nurse tries to give Yukio a cup of water, he knocks it away and screams. He can't look at water anymore. To him, water isn't life. Water is death. Under interrogation, the survivors don't speak of military tactics or strategic positions. They speak of yellow eyes. They speak of the sound of bones snapping. They speak in broken sentences, sometimes stopping mid-word to stare at nothing. One survivor tells the translator, "The war is easy. Men shoot and miss. The swamp doesn't miss." They're prisoners of war, but they feel liberated. Any prison cell is better than that mangrove hell. The Ramree Island Massacre entered the Guinness Book of World Records as the deadliest crocodile attack on humans in recorded history. Historians still argue about the exact numbers. Some say 500 died to crocodiles, some say 900. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Many died from exhaustion, drowning, disease, wounds from the earlier battle. But the math of the survivors remains the same. 1,000 went in, 20 came out. That's a casualty rate of 98%. What makes this story even more complex is the British role. Did they knowingly send those men to their deaths? Some historians say yes, that the British commanders knew exactly what was in that swamp and used it as a weapon.
Others argue that the Japanese had a choice: surrender and live, or retreat and take their chances. But here's what we know for certain. British soldiers heard those screams. They heard men being eaten alive for hours, and many of them carried that sound for the rest of their lives. One British sergeant said years later, "We fought the Japanese for 4 years, hated them, but that night I prayed for them, prayed it would be over quickly." The 20 survivors of Ramree Island were scattered to different POW camps. Most never spoke of what happened. When they returned to Japan after the war, they didn't talk about it with their families. But they had nightmares. Decades later, they still had nightmares. One survivor, Yukio, the same Yukio who was pulled from the tree, never went near water again. Not rivers, not oceans, not even bathtubs. He sponge-bathed for the rest of his life. When he died in 1983, his daughter found a journal. In it, he'd written one sentence over and over again, hundreds of times. "The eyes are still watching." So what does the Ramree Island massacre teach us? Is it just a horror story? A cautionary tale about crocodiles? No, it's something deeper. It's a reminder that despite all our technology, all our weapons, all our intelligence, we are still animals. We are still part of the food chain. We're not separate from nature. We're not above it. Those Japanese soldiers had the best training, modern weapons, tactical knowledge, and it meant nothing, because in that swamp, the rules changed. The crocodiles didn't care about military rank. They didn't care about the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere or the British Empire. They just saw food. Saltwater crocodiles have existed for 90 million years. They survived the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. They've watched entire species rise and fall, and they haven't changed because they don't need to. They're already perfect at what they do. We humans, we've been around for maybe 300,000 years. We've had civilization for 10,000. We think we own the planet. Ramree Island showed us we don't. Today, if you visit Ramree Island, and very few people do, it's quiet. The mangroves have grown back, thick and impenetrable. The crocodiles are still there, guardians of the swamp. Local fishermen won't go into the interior. They say it's cursed. They say that on the anniversary of the retreat, if you listen carefully to the wind in the trees, you can still hear screams. Is that true? Probably not. But symbols matter, stories matter, and Ramree Island has become a symbol of nature's raw, uncaring power. This story happened during World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history. 70 million people died, cities were incinerated, entire populations were exterminated. But somehow, this one night in a swamp stands out. Why? Because it wasn't war. It was something more primal, more honest. War has rules, strategies, objectives. What happened in that swamp had no rules. It was pure survival, and the humans lost. I want you to remember something. Those 1,000 soldiers who marched into that swamp weren't monsters. They weren't cartoon villains. They were young men, most of them, farmers, shopkeepers, students, somebody's son, somebody's brother, and they died in terror.
Their last hours weren't heroic. There were no brave last stands, just darkness and screaming, and the certainty that the thing hunting you is faster, stronger, and more patient than you will ever be. That's the real horror of Ramree Island. Not the crocodiles, not the violence,
but the reminder that no matter how much we advance as a species, nature can still reduce us to that most basic state: prey. The Ramree Island Massacre is verified history. It's in the Guinness Book of World Records. It's been studied by military historians, naturalists, and psychologists. But it's also been questioned. Some modern historians think the numbers might be exaggerated. Maybe it wasn't 1,000 men. Maybe it was 500. Maybe only half died to crocodiles and the rest to disease, drowning, exposure. But here's what we know beyond doubt. Men went into that swamp. Very few came out, and the ones who did were never the same. If you found this story disturbing, good. History should disturb us sometimes. It should remind us that the world is bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than we like to think. If you want to learn more about stories like this, history that textbooks skip over, the terrifying, the strange, the unbelievable, subscribe to this channel, because we go to the places most historians won't touch. And remember, stay out of the water.